Good morning.
Good morning.
I was just talking to Constance and saying that I hadn't remembered that this was Mother's Day. It's the funniest thing because the talk is somewhat on Prajñaparamita, and so somewhere in my mind I was remembering it was Mother's Day. My mother has dementia, and so it doesn't matter what day of the year it is, it's for her. So Mother's Day is every day. So I am sitting here seeing all of you, and my first thought is just how much gratitude I feel for all of you, for my teacher, for her abiding practice and care of our practice and our practice place, and all of you, all just wonderful. So thank you so much. I also want to dedicate the merit of this gathering to hear the Dharma to those who are suffering from war and famine on this very day, those who use weapons and those who are targeted by them. May all beings be nourished and safe. So I want to start with a teaching from the Prajñaparamita Sutra that gives a vision of the warm practice that's available to us. The Bodhisattva will always maintain a motherly mind, consecrated to the constant protection, education, and maturing of conscious beings, inviting and guiding them along the path of all-embracing love. This Mahayana mind never succumbs to fear, anxiety, or depression, and is never overwhelmed by the strange adventures of awareness in the three realms of relativity: mundane form, sublime form, and formlessness. So isn't that the funniest thing, that I didn't remember it was Mother's Day? That's the first thing I wanted to say. So the Bodhisattva path is a way for us to for us to heal ourselves and the world. In this path, we live in the wisdom of Prajñaparamita. The Prajñaparamita refers to a way of seeing the nature of reality. It also refers to a particular body of Mahayana scriptures that are centered on wisdom. And the word Prajñaparamita also refers to Prajñaparamita Devi, a personification of the perfection of wisdom, also known as the Great Mother, who was widely depicted in South Asian Buddhist art. You can see images of Prajñaparamita all over the place. So this is I thought about it being interesting that this vision of wisdom was given a feminine aspect for this particular Devi. So the feminine aspect of this kind of wisdom, particularly its motherly manifestation, imagined in these statues, appeals to us because we sometimes experience periods in our lives when we feel unmoored, like we're not untethered, like we're not grounded. This vision of Prajñaparamita as a motherly mind gives us the realization that we have the capacity to find our home wherever we are, to find our sense of stability, worthiness, and rightness in the very mind that seems to bedevil us. So we tend to think of the mind that drives us crazy with worry or fret or that sort of thing as what we want to get rid of. And this wisdom is right in the middle of that same mind. It's not turning away from that mind. As the sutra says, this motherly mind of Prajñaparamita is consecrated to the constant protection, education, and maturing of beings. Of course, that includes ourselves, so we can't forget ourselves when we're thinking about all these activities on behalf of healing the world. It also includes those whom we consider to be horribly wrong-headed. We tend to get a very strong, kind of fixed, rigid view of people we find to be wrong-headed. And this is a soft, motherly mind even for those people. As the sutra says, this Mahayana mind never succumbs to fear, anxiety, or depression, and is never overwhelmed by the strange adventures of awareness. So notice it doesn't say that we never feel fear or anxiety or depression, but just that we don't succumb to them. I really like Lex Hickson's translation of these strange adventures of awareness. I thought that would be your favorite phrase.
I'm going to talk to you about that later.
I thought of you when I saw that translation. So Reverend Vicky, a couple of weeks ago, Reverend Vicky gave a talk about this funny, seemingly ordinary, really in the ordinary world, misconception that she had momentarily. And so she shared one of these strange adventures of awareness that illustrated this process of noticing within a stable and upright, open awareness. This is a process of just noticing that kept her upright through the process until the surprising revelation came. Joko Beck says that the only way to escape this closed loop of the mind maneuvering to fix or correct reality is to see ourselves clearly, and to see ourselves. It clearly involves stepping outside the little mind and observing it. She adds, this process of stepping back is not complicated, but if we're not used to it, it seems strange and new. But with persistence, it becomes easier. And so that when I thought about this, when I read that, I thought about Vicky, that process she went through, that she really was doing all of it with an upright mind and watching the strange adventures of awareness unfold. So this brings me to the next step in our adventure of awareness this morning. How do we open to this mind of Prajñaparamita? Dogen Zenji wrote, "The Buddha way cannot be attained unless you practice. And without study, it remains remote." He presented this sentence in a lecture called Shinjin Gakudo. And he presented it at Kosho Horin Monastery in 1292. And yet it's as fresh today as it ever could have been. And I'll repeat that sentence. The Buddha way cannot be attained unless you practice, and without study, it remains remote. So in describing what it means to practice with the mind, in that essay, he has one section on practicing with the mind and one section on practicing with the body. He said, after resonating with the way and arousing the thought of enlightenment, take refuge in the great way of Buddha ancestors and devote yourself to the practice of the way-seeking mind. He added, sometimes you study the way by casting off the mind, sometimes you study the way by taking up the mind. With that vision of the way-seeking mind, we might think of our personal story of way seeking, and maybe we all have had this experience of somebody asking you what made you interested in Buddhism or in Zen. And I always feel a little taken aback, like, how am I supposed to wrap this up in a short, and it seems like it changes all the time. So I really realized that. Somebody asked me that recently, and so even though I was brought to Buddhism in the past, my present experience changes my past all the time. And so on the one hand, I could say I was seeking something that would reflect who I already was, rather than something that held up a vision of that I would always fall short of. So I feel like that's exactly what I found, that I can be who I am and not be feeling like I need to fix myself all the time. So this turn toward Buddhism was also a rejection, just for me personally, of the religion of my upbringing that I saw as narrowly doctrinal and sin obsessed. In my reading as a literature student, that would be another path, another way that I would have come to this. I had read the Romantic poets and the Transcendentalists, and they themselves had had some experience reading just scraps and bits of Hinduism and Buddhism. So they were quite taken with it and looking. That is very hard to find that information in those days. So when I read passages of where they talked about seeing the connectedness of all things as running through the person as well, the seer as well, I really resonated with that. Walt Whitman said, "I believe a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars." It reminds me of something that the abbot said in a talk recently, that we're quite connected to. This is not a metaphor. This is reality. And Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "I believe a leaf of grass." No, sorry, that was Whitman. Here's Ralph. What you are comes to you. So that it takes some thinking. It's a great thought. And William Wordsworth imagined the poetic imagination as arising from stillness. He wrote, "With an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things." But I also came to Buddhism because I knew I was living my life in a way that wasn't beneficial to me or to others. There was too much work and too little stillness, and there would be glimpses of wisdom, but no dedicated exploration of it. So in his lecture that I mentioned, Shinjin Gakudo, Dogen opens up a broad view of mind. So when we think of mind, usually in everyday life, we might think of the common definition of mind, and this is just something from the internet, from a dictionary online. The element of the person that enables her to be aware of the world and her experiences. So that's usually what we think of as mind. But here's what Dogen says. Mountains, rivers, earth, the sun, the moon, and stars are mind. I just think that's miraculous. I just think it's just so amazing. Just very, very, very expansive view of mind. And then he added, or he asked, at this moment, what is it that appears directly in front of you? So that too is mind. The world in front of us is a vision of the mind. Instead of being something that is internally derived, the mind in Dogen's way of regarding it is a sort of oscillation between subject and object. or better, a realization of the emptiness of that binary of subject and object. So usually I'm the subject and I look at some object and there's a distinction, and like a mountain, and I'm not the mountain. I think that. But this Prajñaparamita shows us that we're so connected that we are it. We are that oscillation, anyway. So after broadening even his listeners' understanding of what mountains, rivers, earth, the sun, the moon, and stars are, he says, the sun, moon, and stars seen by humans and devas are not the same, and the views of various beings differ widely. So he's thus introducing this issue of view, our point of view, how we see things. Our view determines what we see. I remember one time I was walking my dog years ago, and I stopped and picked up a little pine cone, and I thought it would look like a work of art. I was looking at it aesthetically, and Drew comes up and she's like, like, if you got something, it must be food. So she was experiencing the world with taste buds. Like that. We had a very different view on that pine cone. And it really stuck with me. I really saw, man, we lived together, but we had very different ways of comprehending reality. So our view determines what we see, and recognizing the limitations and parameters of our view means that we don't rush to reify what we think and feel about anything in particular. So it's a very, especially, I don't think just in crises, just there's so many times when we see something and we're like, I have an opinion about that. I have a view, and we latch onto it and don't let reality do its thing to show us that maybe there's more to it than that. So I have a story about my time one day when I was taking care of my mother. That seems to relate to this broad view of views. So for me, at least, it was certainly one of my strange adventures of awareness. My mother and I take the same walk every time I visit her, and when we stay out in the woods for one night and one day. We leave the house, we cross the part of the path without shade, we enter the road into the woods, and we walk up toward this one gate at its end. We used to be able to go much further and walk all the way past that gate and all the way down the Smiths Road to this one tree that was it's one of my favorite things in the world. It looks as if it can't live much longer. It has this huge cavity that's clear in it, and it's got this wide trunk, but one of its branches is torn and open, and stretches out horizontally to the plane of the forest floor. It seems like a dead wreck. The eye follows its long reach outward, seeing only ruin, and then there at the end, it flowers into emerald leaves. And we would always arrive at this tree, and my mother would always exclaim, "Poor tree, it's so sad." And I would say, "Oh, no, it's fine. Trees are like straws. The nutrients go on the outside of the trunk, and the inside is often hollow." Because and many creatures in the forest like to live in the trees, in those hollows, in those cavities. And I've probably said that to her as many times as we've had a walk, because we have the same conversation every time she sees one of these trees with cavities showing. She can still be counted on to exclaim over the poor tree. and then marvel that and be consoled by this idea that creatures live in the cavities and love those cavities, and that the trees are doing just fine. Now though we can only take the shorter walk. We can make it on to the first gate, and sometimes we need to even stop short of that quite a bit. I carry a camp stool in case she needs to sit down and rest with her for a moment, and sometimes she needs to lie down, so she'll just lie down on the floor on the road with my canvas hat under her head and look up at the sky and just, oh, it's so beautiful. See how beautiful the sky is. So on this one walk, we had almost reached the gate, and there are so many live oaks out there that many of them we don't know as individuals. We just don't notice them because there's so many of them. But that one day I looked up, and the canopy of this tree was so beautiful, framing this blue sky, and the curving branches of this tree. So I lifted my camera, and I was standing there looking up at that into the top of that tree for a while. And when I turned around, my eyes refocused on the near at hand, and my mother was bent over looking at something on the ground. And she's very impressed by the forest floor. She's 83, and she walks with a forward bend, and so when she's the longer the walk goes, the more bent she is. And so she's quite interested in all these funny little concave indentations in the sand where little insects live. And we often talk about what that insect might be, and what it's eating or what eats it. So she was bent over and saying, "What's that?" And I thought for a second that I saw a thin stream of dark water flowing onto the road from the forest floor. But there's no stream there, and this was a very dry summer, but my imagination conjured water. It only took a second to see that it was a black snake. My mother's curious face and the snake's wary head were aligned. The crisis passed, the snake turned its head and threaded its way back the way it came, the head moving toward the tail in this quick zigzag. And I stood there gripping my mother's arm and wondering why I wasn't more afraid. And she stood in my grip and was laughing and had already forgotten what had just happened. So in that story, you can see all these different views, a number of different views. I've been quite afraid of snakes for years, but I cultivate a curiosity about them because I know they're vital to the ecosystem, and they've suffered such predation. It's very sad in Texas especially, or I want to say that. I've just heard a podcast about these terrible rattlesnake roundups. It's just terrible. So they've suffered this predation from humans, and they're undergoing an alarming die-off. This I found out later might have been a Texas indigo snake. It's a non-aggressive snake that's classified as protected. Once I could see it, I could tell it wasn't venomous immediately, because we've been out there so long. I know the look of a venomous snake, and I stood still and let my body loosen from its fright. And then, I think now, what would the snake's view of us be? It would be quite different to gain a clue of that, because we're not even operating from the same senses that we use to discern objects in the world. That is just such a vision in my mind. So Dogen notices the incredible variety in the way the mind may study the way. He writes, "In this manner, the mind studies the way running barefoot. Who can get a glimpse of it? The mind studies the way turning somersaults. All things tumble over with it. At this time, a wall crumbling away allows you to study the 10 directions, and the gateless gate allows you to study the 4 quarters." Isn't that just so playful? I just think it's playful, and it's also so deep. It really, to think about just reading it now, all the mind studies the way turning somersaults. All things tumble over with it. So our mind is having an effect on the world as we're cognizing it, and the whole world changes as we tumbles over with us when we're doing that. Dogen would consider that question about what brought him to Zen a little differently from the way I did, I'm sure. Norman Fisher relates this story. He begins by saying that both founders of Soto Zen, Dogen and Keizan, both had devout Buddhist mothers who raised them as pious youths and asked them to become monastics. And they became monastics, and they studied with such passion, in part for love of their mothers, Norman says. In one story that has been passed down through history and perhaps legend, when he was at his mother's funeral, he saw the incense smoke curling from the end of the stick. Norman says, "You sometimes see that. It wafts very slowly, the incense at the end of the stick, and disappears." Dogen saw that and somehow understood the teaching of impermanence. That's when he really determined that he would spend his life understanding the Buddha way. We tend to think of a particular condition like this acting as a catalyst for the thought of awakening, yet if we try to locate it, we can't do so. Is it aroused by suffering? Is it aroused by joy? Dogen says conditions do not arouse it, and knowledge does not arouse it. The thought of awakening is what the it is, just so you know. The thought of enlightenment arouses itself. He adds, the entire universe arouses the thought of enlightenment. Dogen ends his discussion of the study of the way with the mind by saying, even though you do not know it, if you arouse the thought of enlightenment, you will move forward on the way of enlightenment. The moment is already here. So this hyphenated term, practice realization, is one of Dogen's key contributions to the practice of Zen. Charlie Picorni encapsulates in a few steps a very long history that got us to Dogen's practice realization. He says, in Indian Buddhism, practice is valued as a means to realization. So it's a technique that helps us get to this state of realization. In the rhetoric of Chinese Chan, Charlie says, this happened many centuries later, the sudden approach of the Linji school devalued practice as a means. So it's not a technique, and they're insisting it's not a technique. There's no distinction. And then Dogen endeavors to develop a re-evaluation of practice, but not as a means. Practice is not a means employed to attain realization. Rather, practice is the expression of realization. So you can think of that sitting in zazen. A lot of times when we're sitting in zazen, since we face the wall, you can see, have you ever seen your reflection on the wall? You look like a little Buddha there, because you are. You're practicing awakening right there, doing that. That's awakening right there. That's what you're doing. And so just to say that again, practice is not a means to attain in realization, it's an expression of realization. Buddha nature is not a static thing, but a function that needs to be brought to life through practice before, during, and after realization. In this way, Dogen affirmed practices including meditation, the precepts, repentance, studying sutras, reciting the name of the sutras. All these are practices that for Dogen means you're doing those practices for their own sake. So for Dogen, all practice is sudden in the sense of not being based on delusion or engaged through dualistic grasping, even when it unfolds in a gradual process of maturation. So you can think of our practice when you start practice, you don't know what's going on, and you gradually get more comfortable with it and you feel at home in your practice, but still it's every moment of that is an awakening moment. So Charlie Picorni notes that dramatic realizations are not the point of practice, but they need not be denied. They may be affirmed as potent crystallizations of practice realization. While there is an emphasis on no gaining idea, is this a familiar concept? Have you heard of no gaining idea? So the idea is you're not sitting in Zazen to get something else. You're sitting in Zazen to sit in Zazen. You're right there in the moment, because you don't want to have a gap between here you are now and there the better way is that you'll be later. That causes suffering in that mindset. So no gaining idea is really important to us. We're not regarding our practice as instrumental or transactional ways to practice because it's an affliction. Rather, seeking can be embraced as the seeking of Buddha nature. What seeks to be free from suffering is awakened nature seeking to be actualized. So Norman Fisher wrote, "Everything that happens is already a manifestation of our original enlightenment, even though we don't notice it. We don't need to enter another condition or improve or disprove anything. The gentle rain of Dharma," he says, "is falling all the time, evenly and freely on everything." And our Zazen practice is the ritual enactment and expression of awakened awareness. So I'll end with the words of a 17th century Chinese nun, Zhi Yuan Xingang. She wrote, "There is no greater suffering than to be caught up in the bustle of worldly affairs. There is no greater joy than cultivating the way with one pointed mind. The way is no other than the greatest joy in the world. Abandoning the way to seek our pleasure is like throwing away food and seeking hunger." May we all be nourished by the Buddha Dharma that already infuses us, maintaining a motherly mind, consecrated to the constant protection, education, and nurturing of conscious beings, bringing peace inside and outside.